Okay, so today on Ancient DOS Games, we're taking a look at Magus, which on the surface looks like an interesting dungeon crawl type game. And that's pretty much exactly what it is. I mean, given who created this and the fact that it was made over the course of 4 years, I think I might have set my expectations a little too high. Well, Magus is fun, but it's also relentless and doesn't explain itself very well. Now mind you, being relentless is par for the course for some dungeon crawls, but not explaining itself well makes the game feel incomplete and unfinished. Now granted, I'm not going to harp on this game too strongly, because it's always been freeware, and even right now, the source code is readily available online for anyone who wants to take a stab at improving upon it. Really, I just wanted to bring attention to this one because I feel it had a lot of promise, and it would be neat to see where it could be taken beyond what it ended up being. And just a heads up, this won't be a long video. This game isn't nearly as complex as it might look, which is both a blessing and a curse in this case. Magus was developed and released by Ronny Wester, better known for Cyberdogs and its sequel C-Dogs, though I've been having trouble looking up valid years of release for this thing, and partly because there's technically 3 editions of this game. The first edition seems lost to time, while the second edition definitely came out in 1993. And as for the third edition, which is the one I'm playing, I haven't been able to properly verify any dates, but it may have been as late as 1997, though again, not certain on that one. In any case, this game is a one-player dungeon crawl, which runs in a VGA 640x480 16-color graphics mode, something very few DOS games actually do because of the performance issues involved with trying to do so. And while the second edition only has support for PC speaker sound, the third edition added Sound Blaster support using most of the same sound effects found in Cyberdogs, many of which came from Doom, so yeah, the audio is kind of weird in this one. As for its current release date, the game's always been freeware and thus never had a physical release. Now, since Ronny Wester's website has disappeared from the net, I'm just going to recommend the usual standby of the DOS Games website at www.dosgames.com. Though I do want to quickly mention that if you're interested in perusing the source code, there's a GitHub repository for this game called Magus Preservation, which I'll have a link to in the video description, which also has tons of useful information present just for anyone wanting to play the game at all. Since again, the game itself does a terrible job of informing the player about stats and everything. When you first boot up Magus, you're tasked to create your party. Now, the interesting thing here is that there's seemingly no limit to how big of a party you can make. Now, naturally, the bigger the party, the more muscle you'll have for taking things out, but the slower your progress will be since you now have to micromanage more units. Now, each party member you create can be one of 9 classes: Shaman, Wizard, Elf, Barbarian, Knight, Dwarf, Druid, Duck, or Duck Mage. And for everyone except the ducks, you can click on the character sprite to change their gender. The only actual difference between the different classes is what their base stats are, which can be adjusted, along with what their starting equipment is, with the only exception being that ducks and duck mages can walk over water, as can some types of hostiles. Each character also has 5 basic stats: health, mana, strength, agility, and wisdom. Now, health keeps you alive, mana lets you cast spells, strength affects how much stuff you can carry around and how much damage your attacks do, agility affects your accuracy, and wisdom affects how potent or reliable your spells are. Now, you have to choose these stats carefully too, because with the exception of gaining health and mana when you level up, these stats do not change throughout the course of the game, unless you equip special items or find potions to drink. Once you get into the game world, you'll be placed in the middle of a room near the top center of the map, with the map itself being 200 tiles across by 320 tiles down. Now, while there's technically no real goal to the game, the best approximation would be to defeat the Dark One, found at the bottom of the map in a special citadel. Now, while the map is not procedurally generated like in most dungeon crawls, the items you find definitely are, thus you'll encounter different items strewn around on each playthrough. Actually playing the game does take a bit of getting used to though, as almost everything is mouse driven. To move a character, you must click in the direction you want them to travel in. Now, you don't have to click on exact spaces, just the direction of travel, and the character will move 1 space, using up movement points in the process. Movement points are also consumed when you equip items, pick up items off the ground, or attack enemies. In terms of other actions you can perform, you manage your inventory in kind of an odd way. Now, left-clicking anything in your inventory simply tells you what the item is. Right-clicking either equips an item or unequips it, keeping in mind that you can't equip something if you don't have free space in your equip slots to do so. To drop an item, you hold Shift and left-click. Picking up items in the world is also weird, since you have to be standing on top, then you have to shift left click on your own character sprite to pull up a list of items on the ground beneath you, which has scroll buttons to cycle through more than one item in the same space. Now, left clicking in the world is movement, or also lets you interact with characters who are right next to yours, while right clicking attacks with your equipped weapons or spells, even if you click on yourself. Which may seem counterintuitive, except equipping potions and using them on yourself is how you activate their effects. Again, it takes a bit getting used to these controls, but once you do, they're not really that bad. Now, right away, one of the first things you need to do in a new game is get all of your characters equipped and prepare for combat, because enemies spawn at a steady pace for pretty much the entire game, with the quality of the enemies you face increasing the further away you are from the starting location. Now, while you can theoretically play this game with just a single party member, I was running into trouble trying to tackle it with both a 3-person party and a 4-person party, so I imagine you need even more to stand even a remote chance. As you move throughout the world, you'll notice there's a sort of line of sight thing going on, which, I mean, it works, but it's not very accurate. Oftentimes I'd make a move thinking it would reveal more things, and then it wouldn't, or I'd make a move thinking it would obscure characters so that they'd be less likely to get attacked, only to find they weren't covered as well as I expected. Now, that said, the odd way line of sight works here can be used to your favor, as any sort of ranged attacks you can perform, both arrows and spells, can be aimed to hit anything at any range, regardless of what looks like it's in the way. Basically, nothing you do can affect something you didn't click on, which can definitely help for keeping archers and spell users safe while having melee fighters up close to the hostiles. Not everything is hostile, though. There's a particular kind of creature you'll sometimes run across, which looks like this brown, furry thing with a hat on. Attacking these creatures is pretty much a death sentence, so instead, if you go up to one and click on them, you'll be able to give them stuff. Now, occasionally they won't want certain things, and they never want anything with 0 weight. Generally speaking, the heavier something is, the more likely they'll want it, and the more valuable it is to them. Now, once you give one of these creatures enough stuff, they're supposed to give you stuff in return, but I wasn't able to confirm the details on how this happens. You also have to keep careful tabs on the quality of the things you find. Virtually every kind of item in the game can fluctuate in effectiveness from -7 to +7. So just because you find a particular kind of weapon or spell you already have, doesn't mean it isn't better than what you've got. The trouble though when comparing weapons or armors or such is, again, the game doesn't really give you any proper stats to work from to understand what's better and what's not. Fortunately, that preservation page over on GitHub has a list of every single item in the game, including its effectiveness values. Thus you can tell how well something works compared to something else simply by adding its modifier to its base value. For instance, most melee users start with a club as a weapon, which weighs 5 units and has a value of 11. A common weapon drop early on are swords, which weigh 4 units and have a value of 9. But if you found a sword +2, sure, it does the same damage as that club, but it weighs 1 point less, and can thus help alleviate the burden of a character. Heck, even minus items can be better than nothing depending on the circumstances. You may also consider dual wielding. All character classes can dual wield one-handed equipment. Doing so gives you a 5-point agility penalty, meaning your attacks will land less often, but every time a dual-wielding character attacks, there will be 2 attack rolls, one for each weapon. You're also going to notice pretty quickly that experience in this game has nothing to do with kills. Instead, every character gains 1 experience point for each successful hit of a weapon or spell. Thus, the game kind of incentivizes having higher agility or wisdom in order to score more hits, as opposed to higher strength to do more damage. Though higher strength also allows carrying bulkier equipment, so you still have to balance all of that out. The last thing to mention is how spells, potions, and other unique items work. There's actually a lot of spells in this game, but none of them are well documented, so it takes a bit of trial and error to figure out what they do, also keeping in mind that spells require a somewhat random number of mana points to cast, which can be a bit weird. Now, potions are not healing items, rather instead they raise your base attributes, thus they're somewhat rare to come across. Now, you also find items which don't necessarily describe themselves very well, but are typically things which improve various base attributes, such as giving you more movement points or raising the rate at which you regenerate health or mana. Now, generally speaking, there's very little in this game you can find which works against you, so feel free to experiment quite a bit. Overall, Magus is not a bad game, but as mentioned earlier, it's really freaking hard and feels somewhat unfinished due to the lack of any useful information being provided to the player about the things they find or fight. This is a prime example of a game I'd like to see a better version of someday in the future, because I like what's here, but the difficulty and lack of info really hinders my ability to play this. Again though, it's always been freeware and even open source now, so perhaps someone else may take up the mantle of making this game better at some point. But even if not, it's still worth a shot for anyone who likes dungeon crawls. Though if dungeon crawls are not your cup of tea, then this one's definitely not going to convince you otherwise. Super easy to set this one up in DOSBox. Just leave cycle set to auto and you're good to go. Anywho, that's all for today's episode of Ancient DOS Games. Yes, this was supposed to come out 2 weekends ago. I've been going through some rough issues over the past while, which I'll elaborate on in the video description for those of you who haven't heard yet, as it's likely going to affect things going forwards. Regardless, gonna do my best to get the next ADG out on time next week, as it's going to be another review, episode 286, where we're going to be taking a look at yet another action game where you fly missions and destroy targets, except we'll be looking at it from an isometric perspective. So be sure to tune in next Saturday to see what kind of game it is which even works that way. Thanks for watching everyone, and extra special thanks to those of you supporting me on Patreon. Here's just a small random selection of you all.